The crystal chandelier above the dining table hummed with a low, electric frequency that felt like a warning. 25 guests sat around us, their eyes darting between my son, Vaughn, and the empty space where my dignity was supposed to remain intact. Vaughn stood at the head of the table, his hand resting dismissively on my shoulder, as if I were a piece of antique furniture he was preparing to auction off. He didn't offer a toast to my 70 years of building this legacy. He offered a eulogy for a man who was still very much alive. His voice was smooth, polished, and filled with a condescending pity that made the wine in my glass taste like vinegar. He joked about my fading memory and how the family business needed a modern edge that my aging hands could no longer provide. I sat perfectly still, my spine a straight line of cold, hard iron that he mistook for frailty. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Una, his wife, giggled behind her napkin, a sound that cut through the room's forced politeness like a dull blade. I looked at Mava, who sat opposite me. Her face was a mask of marble, her eyes reflecting a storm that was only just beginning to form. Vaughn continued his performance, oblivious to the fact that he was dismantling his own future with every smug word. He thought my silence was a sign of defeat, a white flag raised by a man who had grown too tired to fight. He forgot that I am the one who taught him that the loudest man in the room is usually the weakest. I didn't interrupt him, I didn't defend myself, and I didn't let a single muscle in my face betray the calculations I was making. The guests began to look away, the air thickening with the realization that they were witnessing a betrayal, not a celebration. Vaughn finally sat down, looking satisfied, believing he had successfully sidelined me in front of everyone who mattered. He thinks tonight is the end of my era, but he has no idea that I've already decided exactly where I'm going when I walk out that door. The silence that followed his speech wasn't respect, it was the breath before the impact. The room didn't return to its previous warmth. Instead, a brittle, artificial cheer took its place as the guests pretended the air hadn't just turned to ice. I watched Vaughn whisper something to Una, a self-satisfied grin spreading across his face like a stain on expensive silk. Around us, the cousins and business associates were suddenly very interested in the pattern of the silverware, avoiding my gaze as if old age were a contagious disease. I reached for a tray of those modern appetizers Vaughn had ordered, tiny, complicated things that looked more like laboratory experiments than dinner. I managed to drop one into my napkin while trying to figure out if it was supposed to be eaten or used as a conversation piece. Honestly, if this is the efficiency the younger generation keeps talking about, they can keep it. Give me a steak I can actually see without a magnifying glass. I noticed Mava looking at me, her expression unreadable to everyone else. But to me, it was a clear signal that the countdown had already started. People think that when you turn 70, you stop seeing the subtle moves, the slight tilts of the head, the predatory way a son looks at his father's chair. In reality, you see it all more clearly because you no longer have the energy to waste on the lies people tell to be polite. I spent decades building this home and the reputation inside it, stone by stone, while Vaughn spent his time learning how to spend what he didn't earn. He moved to the center of the room again, guiding the conversation toward restructuring the family holdings as if I were already in the ground. It's a strange feeling to be a ghost at your own party, watching people talk about your life in the past tense while you're still breathing their air. I didn't feel hurt. I felt a cold, clinical curiosity about how far he was willing to push this charade. I took a slow sip of water, allowing the silence to stretch until Vaughn shifted uncomfortably, his confidence flickering for just a microsecond. He thinks my stillness is a sign of confusion, a byproduct of a mind that has slowed down with the years. He doesn't realize that a predator is never more dangerous than when it is perfectly still, waiting for the prey to make the final, fatal mistake. The laughter from the far end of the table sounded like glass breaking, sharp and final. As I stood up to excuse myself, I realized Vaughn had already changed the security codes on the office door, locking me out of my own life before the cake was even cut. Vaughn was now holding court near the fireplace, demonstrating some new app that supposedly managed our logistics better than I ever did with a phone and a handshake. I tried to pour myself another glass of the vintage red, but the smart decanter Vaughn insisted on installing refused to recognize my touch. blinking a stubborn red light at my palm. It's a bit rich when your own kitchen appliances decide you've reached your expiration date before the guests have even finished their salads. I didn't wrestle with the machine. I simply reached behind it and pulled the manual release valve I'd installed myself 3 years ago. A secret Vaughn was too modern to notice. The wine flowed, but the bitterness in the room had nothing to do with the grapes. I watched him tell our oldest client, a man who survived the '80s recession with me, that the old ways were a liability in a high-speed market. It's fascinating how quickly people start talking over you, as if you've suddenly become a piece of translucent glass. My son's arrogance wasn't just a phase. It was a calculated strategy to make the room believe I was a fading shadow. Even the way he stood, legs wide, chest out, reminded me of a teenager wearing his father's suit for the first time, desperately trying to fill the shoulders. I felt Maeva's hand briefly brush my shoulder, her touch as steady and grounding as a mountain, a silent confirmation that we were both seeing the same tragedy unfold. I dropped my napkin, and as I bent to retrieve it, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this much clarity about who my enemies were. One of the younger associates tried to offer me a seat with that look of agonizing pity usually reserved for lost puppies. I thanked him and told him I preferred standing because it made it easier to see who was reaching for my pockets. Vaughn caught my eye and smirked, a look that said he'd already won, unaware that the game hadn't even truly started. I stood there, a 70-year-old man in his own home, watching my legacy being partitioned like a war prize while the music played on. The first real blow had landed, and it wasn't the speech. It was the realization that my son had been waiting for my downfall for a very long time. I didn't need to check the office door again to know that the locks weren't the only things he had stolen from me tonight. The air in the hallway felt thin, as if the house itself was bracing for the storm I was about to walk into. I retreated to the sunroom, trying to find a moment of quiet away from Vaughn's booming voice, which was currently explaining crypto divestment to our bewildered gardener. I accidentally sat on a modern, beanbag-style chair Vaughn had gifted me, and for a terrifying 10 seconds, I thought the house had finally decided to swallow me whole. Wiggling out of that velvet trap with some semblance of grace was my greatest athletic achievement of the decade. Through the glass, I saw Vaughn handing out my private collection of Cuban cigars to people who couldn't tell high-quality tobacco from dried lawn clippings. It wasn't the cost of the cigars that stung. It was the casual way he distributed my history as if it were nothing more than cheap party favors. He thinks that because my movements are deliberate, my mind has lost its rhythm and can no longer keep up with his frantic pace. Una walked in, smelling of expensive perfume and cheap ambition, and patted my hand with that condescending gesture people usually reserve for the senile. "Basil, dear, don't worry about the office," she whispered, her smile as sharp and superficial as a paper cut. "Vaughn just wants you to enjoy your sunset years without being burdened by all those dusty ledgers." I looked at her, noting the way her eyes flickered with a predatory greed, and I realized they weren't just taking the business. They were trying to curate my very identity. I leaned in close, letting the silence hang between us until she started to nervously fidget with her pearls. "I've spent 50 years in the sun, Una," I said softly. "I think I can handle a bit of shade." They were already mentally redecorating the master bedroom, picking out paint swatches while I was still standing right there in the hallway. The betrayal wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, calculated erosion committed by people who shared my last name, but none of my character. He had no idea that while he was busy changing the digital locks on the office, I was already deciding which structural foundations of this house I was going to remove first. I watched him toast to his own future, never noticing that I had stopped drinking his wine. The main course arrived, and Vaughn chose that moment to perform his final act of public generosity. He signaled the server to place a specialized, pre-cut plate in front of me, the kind you give to a toddler or someone who can't handle a steak knife. "Just to make it easier for you, Dad," he announced to the table, his voice dripping with a fake concern that made my skin crawl. I looked down at the bite-sized pieces of meat and then at my son, who was waiting for me to thank him for this public strip mining of my dignity. I tried to use the ergonomic fork Una had slipped next to my plate, but it was shaped like a plastic squiggle, and I nearly poked my own eye out trying to navigate a piece of broccoli. If the goal of modern design is to make a man look like he's fighting a losing battle with a piece of cutlery, then they've truly succeeded. The laughter around the table was hushed, the kind of pitying sound people make when they think they're watching a sunset they can't stop. Vaughn didn't stop there. He started telling a story about the time I got lost in the new supermarket, conveniently leaving out the part where I was actually tracking a supplier who owed us $50,000. He laughed as if my tactical silence were a symptom of a mind drifting into the fog. I watched him, my hands steady beneath the table, noting which of our friends laughed the loudest at his little comedy routine. To them, I was a relic being gracefully retired. To me, they were just names being added to a very specific list. I took a slow, deliberate bite of the pre-cut meat, making him wait for a reaction I had no intention of giving. Age hasn't slowed my blood. It's just made it more patient, like a river waiting for the dam to finally crack. The humiliation was a gift, really, because it showed me exactly who was ready to dance on my grave before I was even in it. I felt Mave's gaze lock onto mine from across the table, and for the first time tonight, the air in the room felt like it was charged with high-voltage electricity. Vaughn thought he had humiliated me, but he had actually just handed me the keys to his own undoing. The dessert was served, a deconstructed mess of foam and dust that looked like a plate had been dropped from a great height and called art. Vaughn leaned in, smelling of expensive cologne and the smug satisfaction of a man who thinks he has already inherited the earth. Dad, we've already moved your things to the south wing. It's smaller, easier for you to manage, he murmured, his tone suggesting he was doing me a favor by not putting me in the garage. I looked at him, and for a fleeting second, I wondered if I'd actually raised this stranger or if he'd been swapped for a corporate brochure at birth. A guest nearby tried to explain the healing energy of my aura, and I told her that at 70, energy is mostly the effort it takes not to roll my eyes at my own birthday. I felt the internal anchor I'd held for 30 years finally snap, not from the weight of his insults, but from the realization that I was defending a fortress that had already been looted from the inside. It wasn't a moment of sadness. It was the liberating clarity of a man who realizes he no longer has anything to prove to people who don't deserve his time. I stood up, my movements as fluid as a shadow, catching the way Vaughn's eyes widened with a sudden, misplaced fear that I might actually cause a scene. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I simply smoothed my coat, feeling the weight of the car keys, the only thing I hadn't let him modernize yet. I accidentally brushed the voice-activated light panel on my way out, and it began a relaxing Forest Rain soundtrack that sounded more like a leaky faucet. I let it play, a fittingly chaotic background for the cold order I was about to bring to my departure. My son reached for my arm, but I stepped back with a precision that left him clutching the empty air where his authority used to be. The silence I left behind was a physical thing, a cold draft that followed me as I turned my back on the 25 people who were waiting for a goodbye. I didn't know them. I walked toward the hall, my heart steady, knowing that a king without a castle is still a king, but a son without his father's respect is just a man in a borrowed suit. The driveway was empty, the night air sharp enough to cut through the lingering lie of this celebration. I didn't look back at the lights, because the only thing worth seeing was the road Vaughn hadn't realized I still owned. I didn't head for the front door where the valet was waiting to witness my exit. I walked through the garage, the concrete floor echoing my footsteps like a countdown. I reached for my keys, only to realize Vaughn had linked my vintage sedan to his new home security suite, and now the car was chirping at me like an angry mechanical bird. It took me 3 tries to get the door open because the car's computer didn't recognize my biometric profile in the dim light. Apparently, my thumb has aged out of its own vehicle. I chuckled to myself, a dry sound in the hollow garage, thinking how ironic it is that a man can build a kingdom but can't get his own car to open without a digital blessing. I didn't look back at the house, not even once. The windows were glowing with the warmth of a party that had become a funeral for our relationship. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation or a tearful goodbye. Those are for people who still hope for a change of heart. My rage wasn't the kind that breaks plates or shouts at the moon. It was the kind that simply packs a bag and disappears into the night, leaving a vacuum where a life used to be. I felt the cold leather of the steering wheel, a familiar comfort that didn't demand an update or a modern edge to function. Vaughn thinks he won because he holds the deeds and the passwords, but he forgot that a man's value isn't kept in a ledger he can lock. I started the engine, the roar of the V8 drowning out the ridiculous Forest Rain soundtrack still playing faintly from the house's speakers. I am 70 years old, and tonight I learned that my own blood views me as a hurdle to be cleared rather than a foundation to be honored. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw Maeva standing at the darkened window of our bedroom, her silhouette as still as a statue. She didn't wave, and I didn't stop, because we both knew that my leaving was only the opening move in a much larger game. I drove away into the blackness of the hills, leaving behind the noise, the disrespect, and the son who thought he could bury me while I was still standing. The road ahead was empty, just the way I needed it to be to think clearly about how to dismantle everything Vaughn thinks he now owns. I left the house in silence, but I left Maeva behind with the keys to a different kind of destruction.
I watched Basil's taillights disappear into the shadows of the driveway, leaving a silence in the house so thick it felt like a physical weight. Vaughn walked back into the living room, smoothing his tailored suit with the air of a man who had just successfully concluded a hostile takeover. He tried to hand me a glass of that kale-infused energy water Una insists is the future. I'm reasonably sure it's just liquid grass and disappointment, and I'm far too old to pretend it tastes like anything else. I didn't say a word, instead focusing on the smart light panel that had somehow glitched and was now cycling through a frantic disco strobe in the corner of the room. My son spoke to me in that hushed, therapeutic tone people use for the grieving or the broken, telling me it was time for a change. He thinks Basil's exit was a white flag, but he's never understood that his father only moves backward to gain enough momentum for a strike. Una was already in the dining room, practically measuring the walls for new wallpaper while the guests were still lingering over their coats. I sat in my favorite armchair, the only piece of furniture they hadn't yet replaced with something ergonomic and uncomfortable. Vaughn began explaining his plan to rebrand our family history, his words a stream of corporate jargon that meant absolutely nothing to the soul. I noticed a small smear of that ridiculous phone dessert on my silk cuff and felt a cold, sharp ripple of amusement at the mess he called a triumph. He doesn't realize that while he was busy changing the digital passwords, Basil and I were the ones who built the vault they protect. I didn't look up when he mentioned moving my things to the wellness suite in the south wing. I just let the silence stretch until he began to nervously tap his foot. He thinks my stillness is shock, a mother's confusion at a family falling apart before her eyes. He has forgotten that a mother sees every crack in the foundation long before the house starts to lean. I poured myself a Real drink, ignoring the smart decanting machine that was still blinking an error code at my presence. Vaughn thinks he's finally the master of this house, but he's about to find out that a master without a teacher is just a student waiting to fail. I didn't stay behind to mourn the man who just left. I stayed to ensure that by the time Basil returns, there's nothing left of Vaughn's ego to save. The last of the guests trickled out, leaving Vaughn standing in the middle of the foyer like a general who had just conquered a village of ghosts. He turned to me, his face glowing with the adrenaline of his public betrayal, and started talking about the digital transition of our offshore accounts as if I were a clerk he was about to fire. I walked toward the kitchen, my heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm on the marble he was already planning to replace with something more minimalist. I tried to make a simple cup of tea, but the new voice-activated kettle Vaughn installed refused to boil unless I gave it a verbal authorization code I hadn't been told. After 3 failed attempts, the machine informed me in a cheery, robotic voice that my hydration levels were adequate, which is a bold thing for a kitchen appliance to say to a woman in my mood. I didn't smash it. I simply took a heavy cast-iron skillet and placed it on the induction stove, the old-fashioned way of making a point. Vaughn followed me, leaning against the counter and mentioning that he'd already signed the preliminary transfer of the vineyard holdings. I let the water reach a rolling boil before I turned to him, my voice as calm and sharp as a frozen lake in midwinter. "It's interesting you mentioned the vineyards, Vaughn," I said, watching the steam rise, "because your father didn't put those in the corporation's name." He paused, his smug smile faltering for the first time tonight as he realized the fact he built his coup on was a hollow shell. I took a slow sip of the tea, noting how the heat burned just enough to keep me focused on the move I was about to make. "The land belongs to my family's private trust, not the business you think you've stolen," I added, letting the silence settle around him like a shroud. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the first flicker of genuine terror behind his expensive contact lenses. He thinks he's playing a game of numbers, but he's actually playing a game of blood, and he has no idea how much of it I'm willing to spill to protect Basil's legacy. The house felt suddenly drafty, as if the walls themselves knew the locks Vaughn had changed were now completely irrelevant. He thinks he holds the keys to the kingdom, but he doesn't realize I'm the one who owns the very ground his castle is built on. Vaughn stood frozen, his tablet clutched in his hands like a shield that had just been shattered by a single word. He tried to log into the family asset dashboard, but the screen just spun, a tiny circle of frustration that perfectly mirrored his current life. I watched him struggle with the espresso machine, which began to emit a high-pitched hiss and a smell of burnt rubber because he had forgotten to add water. It's truly a marvel that he can manage a multi-million-dollar portfolio, but can't navigate a simple pump and boiler without causing a minor kitchen catastrophe. I sat at the island, watching him sweat through his $1,000 shirt, and realized that my disappointment had finally evolved into something much more useful: clarity. He started stammering about legal loopholes and parental responsibility, but his voice lacked the resonance it had when he was performing for the guests earlier. I reminded him that responsibility is a two-way street, one that he decided to turn into a dead end the moment he opened his mouth tonight. Una entered the room, her face pale as she clutched a stack of modernization plans that were now effectively worth the paper they were printed on. I didn't raise my voice. I simply pointed out that the house accounts were frozen as of 10 minutes ago due to a security breach I personally reported. Vaughn's eyes darted around the room as if the walls were closing in, which, in a legal sense, they were. I spent 30 years protecting him from his own mistakes, but tonight, I realized the greatest mistake was letting him think he was clever. The turn wasn't just about money. It was about the fact that he was now a stranger in a house that knew his father's heartbeat better than his own. He tried to argue, but I simply held up a hand, a gesture of absolute silence that he hadn't dared to ignore since he was 7 years old. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a tactical withdrawal of the oxygen he needed to sustain his ego. He thinks the worst part is the loss of the land, but he hasn't even noticed that the lights are starting to flicker for a reason that has nothing to do with the wiring. Vaughn paced the kitchen, his polished shoes squeaking on the tiles with an irritating, desperate rhythm that betrayed his panic. He looked less like the powerful CEO he portrayed tonight and more like a man who had accidentally stepped into a trap he spent months carefully setting for someone else. I was reminded of the time Basil tried to optimize our old analog security system. He ended up locking himself in the pantry for 3 hours while the house played loud jazz and flashed the garden lights at the neighbors. At least your father had the grace to laugh at his own absurdity, Vaughn, whereas you just look like a man drowning in a very shallow pool of your own making. You think you've seized control, but you haven't even figured out that those minimalist foyer stools you wanted to toss are actually worth more than your current car collection. I watched him pull out his phone, his fingers trembling as he tried to call his lawyer, only to find that the signal in this wing had been dampened by the very privacy shields he insisted we install for the party. "Mother, you're being completely unreasonable," he spat, though the sharp crack in his voice betrayed his crumbling resolve. Unreasonable is expecting a man to vanish on his 70th birthday simply because you've grown impatient for an inheritance you haven't earned. I pulled a heavy, vintage ledger from the hidden drawer in the island, a physical record that no digital password or server wipe could ever touch. It was dusty, solid, and contained every signature your father and I collected while you were still learning how to lie to your childhood tutors. Vaughn reached for it, but I closed the book with a sharp, final thud that made him flinch as if I'd fired a shot. You've spent so much time staring at screens that you've forgotten how to read the people standing right in front of you, and in this family, that is a fatal flaw. Una hovered in the doorway, clutching her renovation swatches like they were evidence at a crime scene she hadn't meant to join. I leaned back, feeling the cold, heavy weight of the iron keys in my pocket, the ones that actually open the doors that matter. You wanted to prove who is in charge tonight, Vaughn, and you finally succeeded in showing us exactly how much you stand to lose. The shadow near the back door shifted, and for a second, The house held its breath as if sensing a ghost returning to reclaim its halls. It wasn't just his assets he was losing, it was the terrifying realization that the doors he thought he locked were never his to control. Vaughn stared at the ledger as if it were a bomb, his hands hovering over the table in a state of pathetic, frozen indecision. He tried to use his smartwatch to record our conversation, but the device began an unprompted stress reduction breathing exercise with a loud, rhythmic whoosh that filled the kitchen. I couldn't help but chuckle. Even your own wrist knows you're drowning, Vaughn, and it's trying to save you with a pre-recorded comm you don't possess. I remember when Basil tried to hang that oversized painting in the hallway. He missed the stud, took out a chunk of plaster, and then spent 2 days convincing the neighbors it was a new wave architectural feature. He had the strength to own his blunders, but you, my son, are trying to hide behind glass screens and lawyers who won't answer your calls at midnight. I slid a single document across the marble toward him, the formal notification that I was exercising my right as the primary trustee to dissolve the family housing allowance. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost haunting a house that had already rejected him. "You can't do this, Mother. Where will we go?" He whispered, his eyes darting to Una, who was now frantically scrolling through hotel apps that were likely as frozen as their bank accounts. I didn't answer immediately, choosing instead to straighten a stack of mail that Vaughn had dismissively tossed aside earlier in the evening. Every choice has a price, and you decided that your father's dignity was worth less than the title on your business card. You didn't just threaten a business, you threatened the peace we spent 40 years establishing, and now you're surprised that the walls are talking back. I stood up, the movement effortless and heavy with the authority of someone who doesn't need to yell to be heard. Your modern edge has left you standing in a very cold, very empty room, and for the first time, I don't feel the need to bring you a blanket. He reached for my hand, a gesture that was 20 years too late to mean anything, and I stepped back into the shadow of the pantry. I walked toward the back door, feeling the cold air seep through the cracks, a reminder that winter always comes for those who forget to stock the fire. He thought he was losing a fortune, but as I turned the heavy brass key in the lock, he finally realized he was losing the only roof he ever had. Vaughn slumped against the kitchen island, his bravado replaced by the frantic, hollow energy of a trapped bird. He tried to reboot his tablet one more time, but the screen flickered and died, leaving him staring at his own pale, sweating reflection in the black glass. I was reminded of the time Basil tried to install a voice-controlled shower. It ended with him shouting tropic rain at a dry nozzle for 20 minutes while the dog hid under the bed, and the house stayed perfectly dry. At least your father had the sense to dry himself off and admit the thing was a piece of junk, Vaughn, while you're still trying to negotiate with a dead battery. Una was in the hallway, her voice rising in a panicked pitch as she realized the automated valet had locked her out of the closet where she kept her designer coats. I sat down and picked up a simple, physical pen, the weight of it feeling more substantial than any of the digital toys they had used to try and replace our authority. Vaughn looked at me, his eyes wet with a desperation he had never shown when he was busy telling the guests about my mental decline. "You're destroying everything I worked for," he choked out, ignoring the irony that his work consisted mostly of signing papers we had already paved the way for decades ago. I didn't blink. I've seen better men than him fold the moment the stakes became real and the safety net was cut. I signed the final notice of eviction for the corporate entities he had tried to house in our guest wing, the ink scratching across the paper like a closing door. He reached for the pen, but I placed it back in my pocket with a slow, deliberate motion that signaled the absolute end of the conversation. "You didn't build this, Vaughn," I said, my voice like a blade of ice. "You just thought you could inhabit it like a parasite until the host grew too old to notice." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of decades of unearned privilege finally coming to an end in this room. I watched him realize that the safe world he had curated was actually a cage, and I was the only one who held the key. He looked at the door Basil had walked through, finally understanding that his father wasn't running away. He was simply clearing the field for what comes next. The lights in the house didn't just flicker, they dimmed to a steady, ancient glow that only recognized those who truly belonged in these halls. A low, rhythmic rumble echoed from the bottom of the long driveway, the unmistakable sound of a heavy engine returning to finish what was started. It wasn't just a car approaching, it was the sound of the final debt being called in, and the headlights were already cutting through the fog. The headlights cut through the kitchen window, sweeping across the wreckage of Vaughn's pride like a searchlight searching for survivors. Basil didn't burst through the door with a roar. He entered with the quiet, terrifying grace of a man who knows exactly what he's coming home to. He walked past Vaughn without a word, pausing only to manually reset the main circuit breaker that had been groaning under the weight of too many smart gadgets. He looked at me, a faint, weary smile playing on his lips, the same one he gets when he finally fixes a stubborn leak after 3 days of refusing to call a plumber. Vaughn tried to stand tall, but he looked like a child caught wearing his father's work boots, clumsy, oversized, and entirely out of his depth. I handed Basil his favorite heavy-bottomed glass, the one Una had tried to hide in the charity box because it didn't match her minimalist aesthetic. Basil took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving our son, who was now quietly staring at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "You thought the walls made the man, Vaughn," Basil said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that shook the very air in the room. I watched Una try to make a quiet exit, tripping over the ergonomic rug she'd insisted on, proving once and for all that style is no substitute for balance. There were no shouts or dramatic accusations. There was only the heavy, undeniable weight of a legacy that refused to be stolen by someone who didn't understand its cost. We didn't humiliate them. We simply withdrew the life support of our presence and let them see the emptiness they had created for themselves. As they finally shuffled out into the cold night, Basil adjusted his watch, the old mechanical one that doesn't need a satellite to tell him when it's time to move on. He looked at the house, then back at me, and I knew that the storm had passed, leaving the foundation stronger than the day it was poured. We sat together in the kitchen, the only sounds being the ticking of the clock and the quiet hum of a home that finally knew its true owners again. They didn't break us. We stood our ground, and in the end, we won simply by refusing to be anyone other than who we are.